There we are. I think it's probably about time to kick off. So members, thank you again from me and the management team, Kathy and Kirsten, who are on the call with us this evening, for joining us to another one of our lockdown lecture series. And thank you to all those members who have sent through their support for the enjoyable and educational opportunities that we've been giving. Kathy has been doing some great work rounding up a very diverse range of speakers. And some of those come from our own ideas, and quite a lot come from different comments and discussions that we have with members. And tonight's lecture on pancreatic cancer has come through a discussion that I had with one of our members, Joe Davidson, quite a few months ago now, as these things seem to take a little while, certainly with lockdowns and different things that do slow us down. It's really delightful to have the chance tonight to have Joe and Dr. Ben Lawrence and Nyree Smith with us to discuss pancreatic cancer. Joe's an independent director who's been a member of the club for about 6 years, and I would say is a very engaging and very supportive member. So delighted that we've been able to share something that is one of Joe's passions and an area that's close to her heart. So it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Davidson. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you very much to the Northen Club for making this possible. It really is an honour to be able to sort of facilitate this evening's session, because this is a topic that's really personal to me, because I lost my mother to pancreatic cancer about 9 years ago, and obviously that sort of stays with you. So speaking with Ben and Nyree prior to this evening's talk, we discussed why pancreatic cancer is called the silent killer, which you will have read in the intro on the invite. And as Ben said at the time, biologically, it's a brute. It hides deep in the body behind an invisibility cloak, which I quite liked and I think is, quite descriptive, and I'm sure he'll talk more about that. The challenge is that symptoms show up quite late and they can be quite unspecific, so are often attributed to a range of other problems before pancreatic cancer is actually diagnosed, and by then treatment options are often very limited. And as to why there's so little awareness of such a killer disease and such limited research into treatment of it, Nyree summed it up quite bluntly by saying, pancreatic sufferers don't last that long enough to speak up. We all die first. So while that sounds quite blunt, tonight it's about changing that and making the future of pancreatic cancer very different from the silent killer it is today. So it's my privilege to introduce Nyree Smith and her oncologist, Ben Lawrence. Ben was trained at Yale and is at the head of oncology at Auckland University. He's also very actively involved globally in groundbreaking gene sequence research that's going on to find different ways of understanding, profiling, and then treating pancreatic cancer. Nyree is a force to be reckoned with. I'm sure you'll go with that one, Nyree. Diagnosed in 2017, Nyree's on a mission to raise funds through the Gut Cancer Foundation that can be two things really. One, put towards raising awareness with GPs and the public so that diagnosis can be made a lot earlier. And secondly, so that funding can be allocated by the foundation to support vital research that will change the future of pancreatic cancer. And it's through these fundraising efforts of Nyree's that I actually met her earlier this year when I was co-opted by another quite strong force of nature into joining her committee, which was organising the inaugural PanCan Gala. And I am going to take this opportunity to do a complete shameless plug for the PanCan Gala. I've already apologised to Kathy, but not to Michael for this. Originally planned for November to coincide with Global Pancreatic Cancer Awareness Month. Unfortunately, thanks to COVID, the gala has been moved to the 11th of March next year. It will be held at the museum under the dome, and it promises to be a fabulous evening. There'll be free-flowing beverages and canapes. Nathan Haynes will be providing the entertainment, and Mark Hadlow will be the MC. This is a fundraising event, and the key fundraising portion of this will be a fantastic charity auction. We've had huge support, which is excellent. We've got everything from artworks donated by Gail Langsford and Scott Lowry Galleries, right through to an 8-day outward bound course and many things in between. So please, 11th of March, put the date in your diary, buy tickets, come along, bid at the auction, become a sponsor, or just make a donation. All the net proceeds will go to the battle against pancreatic cancer. And if March seems a little too far away, the Gut Cancer Foundation has a full program planned for November. Already they have 37 iconic buildings around the country lighting up purple on the 18th of November, which is the Global Pancreatic Cancer Day. So we've got the Sky Tower, we've got the Oriental Bay Fountain, the Michael Fowler Centre, and a number of other places, Christchurch Airport. So again, if you have any contacts that can light up a building, let us know. And they're also holding a number of other initiatives that you can show your support through, such as holding a purple dinner in the COVID-safe comfort of your own home. So enough of the shameless plug, and time to hand over to the two people who will bring pancreatic cancer story to life for you. So over the next sort of 30 minutes, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the format here. Ben and Nyree will share their experiences as researcher oncologist and patient, and then we'll go into a Q&A. And I really encourage you to ask any questions you've got and all questions you've got on this topic. You will certainly get an honest and open response from these two, and it's an opportunity that isn't to be missed. So with that, I'll hand over, I think, initially to you, Ben, who'll then follow into Nyree, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jo. It's a real privilege to be able to be alongside Nyree tonight. I'm very much a supporting act, and I'm going to just introduce pancreas cancer briefly. After Nyree's spoken, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're hoping to change it and change the outcomes from this really, really tough disease. I've got to say, I really feel a bit overwhelmed. I knew that there was going to be a few of you on this call who I know who have pancreas cancer, but I hadn't expected to see the partners and siblings of people I've looked after before who've had it. And it's quite overwhelming, and just acknowledging a couple of you, John and Greg and Margaret, and just the people at the top of my screen, and I know there's a whole lot more on the other screen, and that I saw before. Just special thoughts to you, and I hope that this is okay tonight for you, hearing all of these things. It's not going to be straightforward, I'm sure, for you, but I think that you want us to talk about this. Pancreas cancer is tough. Jo mentioned it. It's of all the cancers, it's the hardest one to treat, probably, out of everything. It has the worst outcomes, and that's for three reasons, really. The first thing is that it's a bit like, it starts right in the middle of your body. So it's not on the outside, so you can't feel a lump or a bump. It's not under your arm. It's not on a lump in your neck. It doesn't involve one of the main tubes that goes through your body that can get blocked or that can bleed. And so by the time you find out about it, it needs to have changed quite a lot to cause any symptoms at all. And the second thing is, it's really, really resistant to treatment. And that's a bit because it sort of hides in your body a little bit like a barnacle on a rock. You know, you kind of can't see it, and it's almost impregnable. It has a sort of a scar around it, like a cocoon almost of fibrous tissue, which stops drugs getting in, stops radiotherapy getting in very well as well. It makes surgery hard. And it's another reason why, even when you find it, it's really hard to do something about it. The numbers are terrible. When you find it, usually only 20% of people find pancreas cancer when it's still operable. And even that doesn't help that much in the long run, and most people still succumb from pancreas cancer, even if you can remove it. You know, you might have heard these things: 3 months with no treatment if it's already spread. Even with treatment, 9 months. It's on average, these are really tough numbers. Of course, half of people are going to do better than that, but it's still a brute of a cancer. In New Zealand, our outcomes are actually very poor. We used to be as bad as everybody else, but now many other countries in the world have moved past us and are getting better outcomes than we are. So it's desperately important that we improve things. Now, I said at the start that there's three things that make this a tough cancer, and we've talked about a couple of them: the location, the fact that it has this case around it. The third thing is, in my experience, it's the people it seems to affect. And what do I mean by that? Well, the people it seems to affect are just a little bit different in my experience. There's something sort of stoic about them, something uncomplaining, something about the match between a really tough cancer and a place in your body that causes non-specific symptoms occurring in someone who doesn't complain. And it's a recipe for a late diagnosis. And you'll know people like this, and they've been affected in your family, and I know many of them. And the one person I know who I want to introduce you to now, who's just like that, stoic. What adjectives can I use to describe you, Nyree? Determined, never give up.
Stubborn.
I'm so pleased to be able to hear his story tonight alongside the rest of you. So can I introduce Nyree Smith, who it's my absolute pleasure to care for over the last little while.
Thank you, Ben. Ben's been an amazing part of my journey, which I'll touch on shortly. I want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk to everyone tonight about this disease. It's obviously something very special to me. It was actually 4 years ago last Tuesday that I was told I actually had pancreatic cancer. The little story behind that was a month and a half before that, I had changed GPs. I changed my family GP, and I'd gone in to meet my new GP, and she asked me to have blood tests and usual run-of-the-mill tests to start with a clean slate with her. It was out of these blood tests that she found some discrepancy in my liver function that she questioned. I have lesions on my liver, which are non-cancerous, which had been found years earlier. So I promptly told her it was that, nothing to worry about, don't worry about it, it's just my lesions. And she wouldn't take it at that. She just said, no, I'd like to take it a little bit further. Would you have an ultrasound? So I said, okay, fine, no problem. I tootled off and went and had an ultrasound. And she rang me and she goes, still nothing I can really put my finger on, but would you go and have an MRI? And at this stage I went, oh, for goodness sake, you know, I walk 5Ks 3 times a week. I'm fit, I'm healthy, I'm really enjoying life at the moment. I just had my first grandchild. Life was really good. And I said, you know, it's just my lesions. And I said, look, I'll get my liver specialist to give you a call and discuss it, which I did. And he said to me, so I rang him and he said, oh, don't worry about it, Nyree. It's just your liver lesions. I'll talk to her. Don't you worry about it. So I didn't give it another thought for a whole 24 hours. And he rang me back and he said, you've got one really pushy GP. He said, how about we have the MRI just to shut her up? And I said, yep, that's fine. I've got medical insurance. Let's do it. So I went off the following Monday and had the MRI. Walked back into the office after the MRI. I was sitting in the middle of a meeting at work and the phone call rang, and I sort of went off to one of the other rooms to be told on the phone there and then that I had a growth on my pancreas. I actually didn't really take too much in, didn't think too much about it, didn't even really know what the pancreas was, didn't know where it was in the body. I knew it was a bad cancer because I'd had a friend that had passed away a couple of years before from it, but really didn't know anything more about it. So went back to work, you know, and didn't think anything about it. Went to my specialist appointment a couple of days later, and he organised for me to be sent off for an endoscopic examination the following week. Still going to work, didn't think about it, didn't even really tell anyone. I sort of told my husband I was having all these tests and he had to take me to the hospital for the endoscopic, but that was about it. And when I came out from that, the surgeon told me that it was cancer. And within a week I was in Mercy Hospital. My specialist believed he could remove the tumour from the pancreas. So I was in Mercy for Labour weekend that year and had the operation. Unfortunately, he couldn't remove the tumour. When he opened me up, he found that the tumour had encroached enough around one of my main arteries that he couldn't remove it safely. It's funny, I was just saying to Ben the other day, when I was in hospital, one of the nurses told me afterwards that he'd left me on the table, gone off to the cafeteria to ring a colleague in Australia to see if there was anything he could do, and then went back and took a few things out and closed me up. And a week later, I was in Ben's office and met my superhero, as I call him, who promptly made me sick for the first time. I have to point out that I hadn't been sick at all. I didn't have symptoms that I could put my finger on. Ben says I may have been stoic, I don't know. Yeah, you have pains and discomforts and things, but you just sort of put them to one side and keep going. Maybe I did have symptoms, I don't know. I don't recall anything in particular. So as I always tell people, the only time I'm ever sick is when Ben makes me sick. So when he puts me on chemo. So anyway, after the unsuccessful operation, we had, I think it was 3 months of chemo, and luckily it shrunk the tumour enough that they were prepared to operate. So middle of March 2018, I went back to City Hospital, and an amazing surgeon, Sanjay, please don't ask me to pronounce his surname, it's about this long, and 7.5 hours later, he had removed the pancreas and the tumour, and left me hopefully enough of the pancreas to produce insulin. And I was on the road to recovery. Went back to see Ben, who promptly made me sick again for another 3 months for what we called mop-up chemo, to make sure that we got anything that may have been floating around. And in July 2018, he told me I was NED, which is no evidence of disease, which was fantastic, amazing news. I don't know why we caught it early. Pure luck. Pure luck I changed my GP. Pure luck that she was pushy and made me go further for tests. And I've often questioned why I was so lucky, but that's why I've become on a mission to raise awareness, raise funding for this horrible cancer that hardly anyone knows about. After I was classed NED, and my husband and I tootled off back to North America, and were there in time for the birth of our second grandchild, as our daughter lives in Canada. And we bought a fifth wheeler and a truck, and we spent 7.5 months touring around America and parts of Canada, and came back to New Zealand at the very beginning of November 2019, where after I went back in for tests, the cancer's back, and I have it in my lungs now. It is pancreatic cancer. I can never pronounce the word correctly. Ben, please help me there. He's muted himself, you can't hear him. Anyway, I'd have to look it up. I have spots in my lungs. Shall we carry on? So he promptly put me back into chemotherapy, and I had chemo from November through to the end of February this year, where we decided to, it was stable enough that we could stop the chemo. So I go every so many months now for scans, and the cancer in my lungs is growing, but very, very slowly. And so I class myself stable and lucky. And therefore, while I'm here, I need a reason for why we caught it early. I'm one of the lucky ones who have survived. I was asked by someone last year why no one hears about pancreatic cancer. And as Joe said, because most patients die and die quickly. There aren't enough of us left to advocate for pancreatic cancer. The families of the patients themselves, because it is such a fast cancer, are generally in shock through the speedy death of a loved one, that by the time they have come to terms with it, the loved one's died. I'm sorry if that's a bit harsh for some, and there's just no one out there to talk about it. So that's what I'm doing. I must have survived this long for a reason, 4 years and going, and I keep telling Ben he has to keep me going for a lot longer. And that's my story. I'm here to raise awareness. If we can raise the awareness around the country, if I can save one life, I can justify why I'm here. So anyway, that's my story. And I thank you for listening. Ben, back to you.
Oh, thanks, Nyree. And the word is adenocarcinoma. I think that's what you're trying to say.
Yes, yeah. I had it written down phonetically somewhere, so I would know how to say it, and I can't find it. So anyway, but thank you. I must say one thing before Ben does come in.
Okay, Moose, I didn't catch it. I'll just go now. Would you give
Keep quiet.
Thank you, darling. Okay, thank you.
One of the things that I emphasize to anyone with cancer, not just pancreatic cancer, but particularly pancreatic cancer because of the speed that it works, is to surround yourself with an amazing medical team. And when I was diagnosed, I made the decision that I would put my total faith in my medical team. And Ben will vouch for the facts that we have interesting conversations at times, and I'm sure at times he gets very frustrated with me, but I trust them totally, and I believe that, they're half of my medical team. I'm the other half and they're the other half, and we work together, and it is such an important part of my journey. But anyway, thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Nyree. Joe, there's a few questions coming through, but I think, do you want me to just talk a little bit more about this cancer and the way we're heading, and then we'll come back to those questions? Or do you want us to talk about them now?
I was going to pause, but there were two sort of quite topical ones. One was, you said, Nyree, that you're half of your medical team, and someone, David, has come and asked sort of, well, what have you done with your diet? Are there changes you've made to your diet? Are there supplements you take? What have you actually done on your part of being half the medical team? And that probably extends to exercise and all sorts of things as well.
It's a big part. Up until we went into lockdown last year, I followed everything that my Ben and the nurses have told me to do, and my other GP. But once we went into lockdown, because my husband and I were intending to go back to North America, as our rig is still up there, I decided that I had to take over the other side of my treatment and look into what else I can do. And with everything I did, I ran through Ben first, and I looked into various other treatments like mistletoe treatment, vitamin C intravenously taken, and all those sorts of things. I have now settled to, I have a supplement routine that I do take, and I don't drink alcohol anymore. I haven't drunk alcohol since I arrived back in the country. I don't say I'm a vegetarian. I'm nearly a vegetarian. I can't do without my bacon in the weekends. but I do eat predominantly vegetarian, and I exercise. Yes, I endeavour to keep my walking regime up.
Valentine's.
Sorry, guys, could you just, if you're not, could you perhaps keep on mute? We've had a couple of enthusiastic backgrounds. It'd be great if people could stay on mute so we can hear Nyree and Ben. Thank you.
There is a woman in England who I've discussed with Ben, who I follow her supplement regime, and through her, with the okay of Ben, I spoke to doctors in oncology in England who specialise in the other side, the supplements. And the supplements I take are for my health benefit, but also to enhance the medical side, perhaps enhance the chemotherapy, rather than to go against it. So my side of it is to enhance what Ben's doing, and Ben's to enhance my life.
Well, that segues nicely to Ben, and also John had a question around what was your chemo treatment, Nyree, but it might be one to lead back into you, Ben.
Yeah, so, well, just actually, it would be useful for me, Nyree, if you just quickly mention what your chemos were, and then for John, and then it'll make sense when I talk about them in a second. Do you remember them?
Oh, okay. The first one was 5FU, and excuse me, I think FU is an appropriate initials for it. It was nasty. 5FU, which is Fluranox.
Fulfurinox, yep.
Fulfurinox. Look, the names are so long that you have to have them written down in front of you, otherwise you can't pronounce them. Gemcapaticide.
Yep.
I honestly, Ben, I take no notice. All I know is that you send me home from chemo with a baby's bottle attached for 48 hours. And as far as I have said, you tell me, I read it, and then it goes out the window because that's your side of it. And I have absolute faith in what you do, and leave that to you. So go for it. I can't pronounce half of them. They should give them easy names. 5FU is a very easy one.
Yeah, I think it's deliberate to make it hard to say, but yeah. So John, lots of different chemotherapies over the last few years, haven't there, Nyree? So
yep.
Tried a few different things, and been lucky that everything's been working. But you know, with things, there's still some challenges here. But we'll come back to some of those same chemotherapies in the future. So if I guess there's a short sort of part of this which is a little bit like a lecture, and so I've just got 3 slides I wanted to show you, and I'm just going to bring those up. Oh, Joe, it just says host disabled participant screen sharing. Are you able to let me, or someone able to let me? It might be Michael.
That's not me. That's a Michael or a Kirsten, please.
Oh, yep, that's working now. Thank you very much.
They don't give me that much control, Ben.
I'm just trying to find it here. Oh, here we go. So I'm just going to show 3 things, because what I want to show you is, firstly, how chemotherapy works. Secondly, what's going to follow after chemotherapy, what we're working on now. And thirdly, a trick that we think is going to be a game changer for how to get chemotherapy into the body. So the first thing is that this is Nyree, a human, animal, or a plant. It could be any of us. And what we're made up of is cells. And there's a lot of cells. And you know, you might want to think how many cells would be in our human body, right? A cell is too small to see with the naked eye. You have to look down a microscope. There's lots of different kinds of cells. You know, there's cells in our eye or our toe. Is it a million? No. Is it a billion? You know, that's a lot of cells, but no, it's not that. Is it a trillion? So 1,000 billion. It's more than that. It's probably somewhere between 10 and 50 trillion cells in our body. So there's a lot of cells, and most of those cells have a little control center in the middle called a nucleus. So a lot of control centers. And inside each of those control centers are these 23 little cross-shaped things like this called chromosomes. And they are little packets for a whole lot of DNA. And you can kind of think of DNA in some ways as this one big long strand. And it's a bit like a huge long piece of computer code. If you imagine computer code, we know that's binary, so zeros and ones, and that can spell out the shape of the world. DNA is even a bit cleverer than that. It can hold more information because at any one point, there are 4 options, not just 0 or 1, 2 options, but 4. You can see them here. There's red, blue, yellow, and green, and they work in pairs. And so if you can imagine at any one point, you could have any one of those 4. So it allows this strand to carry a huge amount of information. So that strand is long. It contains 3 billion of these little pairs. And that's divided, that's, you know, in a big long string, and it's in each one of our cells. So remember we had 30 trillion cells, or 10 to 50 trillion cells, each with a control center, each with DNA in it. Each of those cells has 6 feet of DNA. And this is tiny stuff. It's so small you can't even see it with a microscope. So tiny. How do you fit it in? Well, it's a bit like if you took a shoelace or a string and you started twisting at each end in opposite directions, it forms a knot. And then it forms another knot. And then the knots all close over each other and start getting tight. And then they form knots on knots and knots on the knots on the knots when it's really long like this. And that's what those chromosomes are, those blue crisscross things. And they open and close as the cell does its different jobs. And if it's in a cell in your eye, it will use part of the DNA that's relevant to seeing. And if it's a cell in your toe, it'll, you know, use part of your DNA that's, you know, maybe muscular or bone, depending on which part of your toe it's in. So it can do a lot of things. So the way cells grow is that every time a cell grows, it doesn't get bigger and bigger. It actually splits into 2. So it becomes 2 cells. And then those 2 cells don't get bigger either. They split into 2, and they split into 2, and so on. And so you can see that there's an issue here, because in every cell in our body, if you've got 3 billion pieces of DNA code and you need to make another cell, well, then you need to copy all of that 3 billion pieces of code. It's unbelievable that it can even happen once, but it's happening all the time in our bodies. And while I've been talking, you know, millions of cells between us have been copied and divided like this. Chemotherapy works by stuffing up that copying. It causes some chemotherapies, and Nyree was just talking about all the different names there. And the way, for example, Nyree's had 5-fluorouracil, oxaliplatin, capecitabine, gemcitabine, all of these crazy sort of long names. The reason they have different names is that they stuff up the DNA copying in a different way. So some of them cause tangles, some of them cause cross-linking in this big long strand. Some of them put in, say, for example, that little green spot you can see there, gemcitabine puts in a fake one of those, so that when the DNA is trying to copy itself and make another new 3 billion pieces of DNA, little fake bits of DNA get in the code, and so that it doesn't actually work, even though the cell thinks it will, and that cell will die. If the DNA get tangled, the cell can't grow because it can't form a new cell, and so on. And that's what chemotherapy is. So all it is, really, is that it just stuffs up the copying of DNA. And for Nyree, when she had a cancer that wasn't resectable 4 years ago, we were able to give her chemotherapy, which stuffed up the DNA. This cancer cells got stuffed up more than the normal cells, and so the cancer shrank, and it was able to be removed at that time. What we didn't manage to do was to get rid of every last cell. And so some cells stayed in her body, even though we didn't know about it for quite a long time, until they were big enough to show up on a CT scan. And that's when we found out about them. So chemotherapy hits this DNA, it's like a blanket though. It just goes all through the strand. What about if we think about the roles of each of those parts of DNA, because the DNA is actually divided up into 20,000 chunks, and they're called genes. So you can imagine there's a lot of DNA in each, a lot of DNA code in each one of those 20,000 genes, and each one of those genes controls a different thing that the cell does, like be a toe or an eye, or grow or stop growing. And cancer happens when mistakes form in DNA, just by chance usually, that control the way the cells grows or stop or should stop growing. Those kinds of things that are really important to a cell being a cell. And so what about if we knew which of the 20,000 genes had the mistakes in it? Which, and we call that a mutation. And if we could match that exact mutation to a drug, and that's what we've started to do. So what we need to do though is to read this DNA, and you can see there's tons of it. And there's so much in our body, it's kind of hard to imagine, because I said before that one cell has 6 feet in it, 6 feet of DNA, but there's 30 trillion cells in your body. And in fact, the amount of DNA, so I'm told, is the amount of DNA in one person's body is enough to span the solar system twice the diameter of our solar system, not even the Earth. We're talking about a long strand. We've got machines now that can read that from one end to the other, and we can do it in about a few days. Used to take, when this started out, back about 30 years ago, it took 14 countries about 15 years to work together to sequence all of the DNA in one person's body. That's called a genome. Now we can do it in a day. And so we can read cancers to find out where the mistakes in them are. Some cancers, this works really well. But of course, pancreas cancer being pancreas cancer, it's tough. The genes that are affected, are really hard to target. And 2 years ago, there was still none. But in the last 24 months, things have started to change. If we think about all of the pancreas cancers, and what was seen in the last 24 months is we're starting to drive a wedge into pancreas cancer by realizing that actually everybody's experience is very different, and therefore it sort of makes sense that they might have different gene mutations in their cancer driving the cancer. So one of the ones is this orange one, which affects 1% of people with pancreas cancer. And it's a mistake in a gene that fixes mistakes in genes. You can imagine if you've got a mistake in a gene that affects the way genes get fixed, you're going to get mutations, and that's what drives cancer. The really great thing about this, though, the bad thing is that you get a cancer. The great thing is that these cancers are exquisitely sensitive to immunotherapy. And even in pancreas cancer, when you've got a mutation in one of these genes, gnarly old pancreas cancer, you can have immunotherapy and 1/3 of people are probably cured. So you find this mutation, there's actually 4 genes in this family, you find a mutation in one of these 4 genes, you give the immunotherapy, and a cancer that would have taken someone's life in a few months can be cured for 1/3 of them, and another 1/3 get a significant prolongation of time in the order of years. So by knowing the gene mutation, we know the drug, we change the outcome. The next one in grey here is a gene called NTRK1. It's actually a gene that's involved in how to be a nerve. But by chance, if you get it in a cancer, it makes the cancer grow in an uncontrolled way, and that's what cancer is. Last year, a study came out with NTRK1 inhibitors, which was quite unbelievable, and no one believed at first, because with chemotherapy, about 30% of pancreas cancers will shrink. With this drug, the NTRK1 inhibitor, it was 100. Every patient on the clinical trial that tested this, their cancer shrank. That's kind of unheard of, and it's coming through that this is consistent across many cancers. And in pancreas cancer, it's not quite 100, but it's very close to it. Above 85% of these cancers will shrink and remain controlled for a long period of time. So knowing the gene, knowing it's NTRK1, having a drug that matches it, suddenly changes pancreas cancer from not just one big cancer to a whole raft of different cancers driven by different gene mutations. BRCA1, you might have heard of that. That's the gene that usually is associated with breast and ovarian cancer. And BRCA2, which is very similar to that, but causes more pancreas cancer. If you've got a mutation in one of these, your cancer, we know from a study published 24 months ago, just under 24 months ago, that your cancer can be shrunk and controlled for a prolonged period of time in the order of, a couple of years on average. Well, not quite average, but 18 months on average, and for some people even longer than that, instead of months, as we talked about before. So we know the mutation, we have a drug that matches it. We don't care that it's what organ it started in. We know something much more important about it than the organ it started in, and these drugs can work. And PALB2 is another gene which is a little bit like BRCA1 and BRCA2. They're in a family of genes that, again, correct mistakes in genes. So if you have a mistake in some of your genes, it's a different way of repair that these things control, and we can use that against it. So we've taken a cancer, instead of thinking about it as what part of the body did it start in, we think about why is it a cancer in the first place. You'll see that most of this pie chart is still dark blue, because these are the mutations that we've found in pancreas cancer by the proportion that they occur in, that are game changing. There's a lot of work to do there, you can see, but there are big chunks of this that we hope to break off over the next few years. Because we now know what the gene mutations are, but we're waiting for the drugs to develop. And the one thing I really want people to know is that there are an enormous number of trials going on in pancreas cancer around the world at the moment. And you think about a trial, a trial is a big undertaking. It costs money. You need sponsors, you need most of all patients to give their time and experience, which people are incredibly generous and do mostly for other people who follow them. But right now in the world, there are 678 pancreas cancer trials that are recruiting. So that's the active phase of the trial, not just in follow-up, not just in planning, but actually recruiting patients onto the trials, using this type of idea, taking these gene mutations and matching them to drugs and seeing if they can be successfully treated. So grateful for all of that work going on around the world. So now we've talked about chemotherapy, and we've talked about molecular targeted therapy. And there's just one more thing I wanted to show you. And one of the reasons I want to show you this is that it's very cool. We're opening a clinical trial testing this next year, early next year, and it's supported by the Gut Cancer Foundation. So that's through the work of the fundraising, New Zealanders giving to this project so that New Zealand patients can participate in the trial. And I just want to show you what this trial is all about. This is a mouse a rat actually, with pancreas cancer, unfortunately, for this rat. And you can see that white arrow and that green mouse there, and that's pointing at the pancreas. That big round lump there, that's not all pancreas actually, it's just the bottom half and the sort of the bit near the arrow. The rest of that's liver and some other bits and pieces. And this mouse has had chemotherapy injected in it, and with mice you do that through a vein in their tail. And the chemotherapy has something on it that makes a chemotherapy glow. That's just for the purposes of this experiment. So what this picture shows on the left is where the chemotherapy is in the body at the time this photograph was taken. And then what you can do is you can put in another substance which suddenly completely wipes out the fluorescent effect. Chemotherapy is still there, but it wipes out the fluorescent effect. And as the chemotherapy moves out of the body, the only thing that will be left in the body is chemotherapy that sits inside cancer. And that's because the stuff that wipes out the fluorescence can't get it inside to the organs. What you'll see on the right is, even though a whole lot of chemotherapy is washed through this body, there is nothing inside There's no chemotherapy sitting inside the pancreas once that chemotherapy washes out of the body. And that's where that little white arrow is pointing to the pancreas. So it's as if you've washed this mouse with chemotherapy, none of it stuck, and it's all exited the body without ever getting into the cancer. You know how I said before that chemotherapy, that pancreas cancer is sort of like a barnacle on a rock with a protective shell around it, or a cocoon with a scar around it. That's what this does. The cells seem to have this impenetrable barrier around them for many drugs, including some otherwise effective chemotherapies. So clever scientists have come up with this molecule called CEND, C-E-N-D. So it's CEND with a C. And what it does, it's like a nano hole punch, and it can go get that barnacle layer, that cocoon, and just put microscopic holes all through it. The crazy thing about it is that the drug itself is really well tolerated. There were no side effects in the trial where it was first given to people to see whether it would cause side effects. No one got side effects, so it's very safe. So you can give it with chemotherapy without adding any extra side effects. So what happens when you give it to this mouse? So you can see on the left the same image, the chemotherapy washing through the body, this time with the CEND drug. And then you can see on the right that when the chemotherapy washes out of the body, and is neutralized everything except for what's in organs, you can see that the pancreas cancer is full of chemotherapy. And that's because the drug has made these tiny holes all around the cancer and allowed the drug to get in. And does it work? What about when you give it to people? And so a small study of 30 people was conducted last year. And this is called a waterfall plot. This is a study that was done in Perth. And you can see these 30 people. When the bar goes down, that's cancer shrinking. When it goes up, that's cancer growing. And you can see really clearly here that about 85–90% of people's cancer shrunk. Not quite perfect, but pretty spectacular from what was really only a small study just to check that it was safe. So you've taken a study, you've effectively more than doubled the number of cancers that shrink just by adding this otherwise harmless medication. And so we're opening this study in Auckland early next year, funded by the Gut Cancer Foundation, because when we run these studies, there's usually a shortfall. In this case, about $4,000 a patient to get onto the study, which we provide through fundraising. In terms of the fundraising we do, we've got Liam on the call tonight, who's the CEO of the Gut Cancer Foundation. But we do things like, we try to be pretty creative. There's these things called gutsy challenges where I had, for example, had to walk up 6 mountains in 6 days for fundraising with a group of other oncologists and things like that, to try and get the money together to get people to participate in these trials. And as you heard earlier from Joe, Nyree's got a plan to do this kind of thing, but with an amazing gala, and the support from the community has been incredible, and it's going to be a really fun night. So I'm going to stop there. What I've described is what I hope you'll feel is that nobody is resting on their laurels. This is a really tough cancer. There's a lot of work going on around the world to change the outcomes for people, either using chemotherapy better, sequencing the genomes of the cancers so that we can match it to a targeted therapy, and using clever new drugs like this one here that we're still seeing there that allows the chemotherapy to get inside tumors that would otherwise be excluded. So I'm going to stop that sharing there. And what we're really keen to hear is your questions or comments or thoughts, and happy to answer anything. I'm sure Nyree will be too.
Okay, right. So that was fascinating. I haven't heard that. It's quite hopeful, Ben, albeit with a long lead time for these things. And it's really interesting to hear about the New Zealand specific trial. So how do people get onto clinical trials? What's their access onto them?
Yeah, so to get onto a clinical trial, firstly, you have to be in the right part of your cancer journey. So, for example, that trial will only be for people who haven't had any treatment yet, and it'll be their first treatment. There are some other rules for clinical trials. Sometimes you have to have a certain mutation in a certain gene. Sometimes you always have to be pretty good shape, so pretty strong, because it's when we're trialing these things, we want it to go well for that person. Don't want to accidentally make them feel worse. And there are sometimes, for example, if you've got 2 cancers, sometimes that excludes you from a trial, or if you've got another significant health problem, sometimes that excludes you from the trial. So in general, you need to be in reasonable shape, and you need to match the criteria for that trial at that time.
Okay, thank you. Were a couple of questions earlier just around and backtracking quite a bit to the sort of the GP, because obviously for Nyree, you managed to push your way through into a territory you weren't expecting to go because of the nature of your GP. And with my mum, for example, unfortunately, she had a GP and mum was remarkably stoic. So I was like, no, I'm fine, I'm fine. So she didn't push. What sort of things should we be asking our GPs? What are the questions we should be asking? When should we push? When should we not push? What are the tests we should be asking for?
What's your thought, Nyree?
Well, the symptoms for pancreatic cancer are so vague. I've told people when they've asked this question is, if you go to your GP and you're not comfortable, or something just doesn't sit right with what they're doing. So if you have abdomen pain and back pain perhaps, and you go to your GP and they go, oh, you've probably overdone it in the garden or something, and you go, well, actually, that doesn't sit right. Keep pushing. One of the things that one of my things with raising funds is a public awareness program which will cover GPs to give them the confidence to keep pushing for, if they have gut feelings, to keep pushing for their patients to have further tests. My tests started with a blood test and followed through by an ultrasound, which was what my GP ordered, and then on to the MRI. It's a gut, as I said, the symptoms are so vague. It's really hard. So I want to get the awareness program out there so that New Zealanders know what the symptoms are, and even though they could relate to something else, but if they feel uncomfortable about anything, to push for it. Just keep pushing for further tests, get an ultrasound done, go from there.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple just around, probably following on from your trial overview, Ben. So you said the funding is coming through from things like gut cancer and Nyree's fundraising. Do the drug companies, is it common practice to pay drug company to participate in a trial? Like what's the role of drug companies, and does that vary globally from New Zealand, and how does it happen around New Zealand itself?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's different kinds of trials. So the most common trials that happen around the world are drug company sponsored, and that's because they ask a question that's relevant to the business plans of their company. They are trials that we do at Auckland Hospital, for example. We have about 30 or 40 running at the moment. We make money out of those as a hospital, because the drug company pays the hospital favorably, and so you make a very small profit. That usually run just slightly in profit, so that allows our trial group to keep running and getting by. The thing with those trials, though, is that we don't get to set the agenda; the company does, and we don't get to test our ideas in the clinic, for example, if a drug has a good patent life, it's something that a drug company would want to do a trial on. But if a drug's coming to the end of its patent, or the patent's not well protected, or and actually the drug company only has a certain amount of capital and it's focusing it in one direction on one cancer type, usually a common cancer type, but we see value in it in another direction, then sometimes you'll start a trial which is called an investigator-initiated trial. And they are less common than the big pharma trials, but they're the most important, because often you are seeing a vulnerability in a cancer or in a population type or a matching to an opportunity that doesn't exist everywhere in the world that you can do well in your particular area. And this is the case for this trial. So these trials lose money for a hospital because they don't have a big pharmaceutical company backing, and running a trials is very expensive. When you run a trial like this in Australia, for example, so this trial that we're doing, it's shared with Australia. They price the trial and they get funding for it through the Australian government, for example, at a certain number of $1,000s per patient. And the cost of that is also offset by the Australian hospitals, who accept that running clinical trials is the only way to improve the future, to do better. And that's part of clinical care. In New Zealand, our hospitals run a much tighter ship, and they are, everything is, every cost is accounted for. And so our hospitals there's a shortfall of about $4,000 for exactly the same trial that would run neutrally in Australia. We're short. And that's because it doesn't have that big pharma backing, but also because we're a more expensive place to run a trial because it doesn't get the extra support from our hospital. So yeah, in this case, and for pretty much all investigator-initiated trials, where it's a non-pharmaceutical company idea, you do make a loss. And so we rely on government funding and community funding. Government funding in New Zealand is pretty limited. The Health Research Council and funders like that have a very small purse to play with. And so we do other forms of fundraising as well in New Zealand.
Which is obviously one of our key reasons for having you and Nyree on the call tonight. There've been a couple of questions just sort of around both symptoms and support, actually, because I see we're sort of at our hour, so I'm conscious, people will be needing to move on to other things soon. Couple of questions around types of symptoms, for example, weight loss, but then also a question around, is this one of the most misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed cancers? So is that one of the reasons why the stats are so poor? And I think this is something you sort of touched on right at the start. But
yeah, to be honest, I can see some GPs on this call who would be better at answering that question than me. But because mostly by the time I meet people like Nyree, the cancer's actually already been diagnosed. But yeah, it's a tough thing to diagnose. It's hidden in the middle of your body. It doesn't press on anything to give it away, unless it's at one end of the pancreas, which makes you sometimes go yellow. And so symptoms like weight loss are definitely one of the presenting features of pancreas cancer. Very non-specific, because as we all know, there's lots of reasons why you might lose weight. And sometimes you even try to, and then you succeed and you think, gosh, I finally managed to lose that weight. And of course, the irony being that it wasn't just you. It's a really common story, unfortunately. So yes, weight loss is a, which I think was what the question that came up on the chat, unexplained weight loss, despite, eating well and doing all your normal things, is certainly a symptom to worry about.
And Liam's kindly, Liam, who's the CEO of Gut Cancer Foundation, has just put a link up, which we can copy in tomorrow's email as well, which shows what the symptoms are, which is on the pancreatic gut cancer website. So we'll send that email out with you as well. And I think probably shortly we will need to wrap up, because I want to thank everyone as well. But one question that came through earlier, Nyree, and it was acknowledging that while you said there's not many people there to raise the flag and fight the fight, what are the support options out there for people like yourself? And I've certainly seen you reach out on a personal basis to somebody you didn't even know. So, what are the support options out there? Who can people go to when they're going through this pretty horrendous time?
When I was first diagnosed, and for a long time I called myself the forgotten patient, because I'd look around, and for other cancers there were some amazing support groups, and I have to kudos to the Cancer Society. They have been amazing in support. They also, my local hospice, which I belong to, are fantastic, and they are all around the country. In specific for pancreatic cancer, a friend in Christchurch has started a Facebook page for a pancreatic cancer, anyone that's interested in it. It's Pancreatic Cancer Aotea New Zealand. And she also has a private group for patients, which she started 12 months ago, which is slowly growing. So if you have any interest, I suggest you look it up on Facebook. Facebook support groups have been a huge help for me. I found one of my good friends, my first other pancreatic cancer patient, through an American Facebook page, and she and I used to meet once a month for coffee, and it was just, I have to say, the support of being able to talk to someone who knew exactly what it was like to have pancreatic cancer was amazing. So through Bryony in Christchurch and we've started support groups here in Auckland and one in Christchurch at the moment. In Auckland, we would meet one Sunday each month, usually at Palmer's in Remuera. The group is slowly growing as the word gets out, and it's just a matter of being able to come, no pressure, talk. It's just nice. Particularly, we include the caregivers and anyone affected. We have a number of children, that adult children who have lost parents. They come, and we have, I think at the moment, approximately about 5 actual patients, and it's actually just lovely to be able to talk to someone who knows exactly what they're going through for pancreatic cancer. It's always advertised on the Facebook page when we're having these catch-ups, which will be after lockdown again, I assure you. I also do, I contact anyone. I've spoken to a few people who have got in touch with me that have cancer, pancreatic cancer, and just to sort of touch base when they first get diagnosed, to give them support and let them know that there's always someone at the end of the phone if they ever need to talk. And I'm working on that. We're hoping to get these groups up and running around the rest of the country slowly, but yeah.
Because certainly fundraising, I know, is prioritised at the moment, into awareness and also into the research, and those are both critical things. The momentum that you have and other people like Bryony have to have the support groups informally formed is excellent. And Liam's kindly put up the Facebook link as well, so that people can click on that, and we can include that next time too. Okay, I mean, I think there will be a few more questions. There's just one now, which I thought was quite interesting, because when Ben, you made the point when we were talking on Friday about stoic people getting it, and I mentioned earlier that was so my mother. Someone has come through with the question is, are there any other sort of either age groups, lifestyles, genetic, is there anything specific that means somebody is more likely to get it, or is it still at this point, while you're going through the gene sequencing, seeming more random than that?
Yeah, I think, for many years with all cancers, we've tried to look at lifestyle factors and, age and gender and all of these things that we've been able to quantify. And yes, we can see associations with some things. Drinking more was associated with pancreatic cancer, some things like diabetes, but carrying more weight. But for every person I see like that, I see more that don't have those risk factors. And I guess what we're realizing more and more with cancer is that there's something else going on. And usually it comes back to that picture I showed you with that big long strand of DNA that has to be copied every time a cell divides. And when that copying happens, mistakes happen. And, it's almost perfect, but it's just not absolutely perfect. And if you have a 3 billion of anything and you make a 0.0001% error rate, you're still making quite a lot of mistakes. And so just as the cells in our pancreas copy and divide and grow and replace themselves, they pick up these mutations, and statistically, just by chance, some people are going to get mistakes in the genes that control the way the cell grows, and they're going to turn into cancer. And there are some things that might encourage that, like being a little bit bigger or drinking a bit more, but really, mostly, it's just rotten luck. And pancreas cancer, as much as anything, just rotten luck.
Okay. Well, I think on that note, it would be great to sort of probably wrap up there, because while it's rotten luck, it's been fantastic luck for me that, you know, I was my mother's daughter, another friend who's been on the call who lost her mother a couple of years ago, and Nyree, you have just been an incredible person. I've been so privileged to work with you through this year, and that gala will go ahead next year on the 11th of March. And so Ben, Nyree, thank you so much, both of you, for your really open and honest conversation. This is one of those topics where people need you to be open. It's not something you can have a stigma around honesty for. People want to understand and want to be able to see how they can work through it. So the rapport that you guys had that was so obvious on Friday and again tonight is fantastic that you've got that with each other. Thank you too to everyone that's joined us. It's fantastic. We've had so many people here. We hope that this evening has sort of helped you maybe understand a little more, given you some places you might want to go, given you the inspiration to go and talk to your friends and family and colleagues. And Kirsten tomorrow is going to send the video out from this conversation. She'll also include the PanCan Gala website, but also the Gut Cancer Foundation, pancreatic cancer. So some really good information on there, some really good ways that you could support, but also places that you can go to ask more questions. So please do take that up. It's not something that you should be doing on your own, whether you are the person with cancer or whether it's your family. Having that support around you is just so important. And Michael, thank you very much to the club for giving us this opportunity. Ben and Nyree, I don't know if you want to say any last wrap-up words before we're off, but thank you both so much. It's been fantastic.
Thank you. You go, Nyree, and then I'll just say one thing.
I was just going to say thank you very much to the club for having us. It is such an important subject that we need to really get the awareness out there. So thank you for listening.
And yeah, Nyree, just thanks so much to you for your openness and sharing and being able to talk to everybody about this really, really important topic for New Zealand. The key thing for me is that, you know, we can do our best with the tools we have, but we're still not far. The only way to change the future is discovering new things, and that's research. I wish there was an easier way, because research is hard, it's expensive, and it doesn't always work, but it's the way. It's the way forward. So thanks for thinking about supporting the gala and Gut Cancer Foundation.
Thank you.
Michael, over to you to dismiss us for the evening.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jo. And thank you to all the members for being online with us this evening. Particularly thanks to Jo, Nyree and Ben, and also in the background there, Liam, who was doing some good work in supporting with those links, and the work that Liam and his team do is fantastic. So thank you to everybody. And another slight, confronting topic this evening, but so valuable that we're able to have some time to hear the insights that Ben and Nyree were able to give us. So thank you to all the members. We will see you later this week for another couple of lectures, so do stand by for those. Keep an eye on your email with the details, and do get registered for those coming up in the next few days. And again, on behalf of Kathy and Kirsten and myself, thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you, Jo.
Good night.
Lovely.
Thanks, everyone.